The Galactic Academy for Advanced Sciences had seen many species walk through its pristine corridors over the past 3 centuries. Crystalline beings from Xerion Prime, whose bodies chimed like wind instruments when they moved. Gas-form entities from the nebula colonies, contained within specialized atmospheric suits that shimmered with their ever-changing colors. 6-limbed Korthak warriors, whose chitinous exoskeletons bore the ritual scars of their coming-of-age ceremonies. But none had caused quite the stir that Professor Sarah-chan did on her first day. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall, unremarkable by most galactic standards. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard academy teaching robes that seemed too large for her small frame. What marked her as different wasn't her appearance. It was the small metal tag on her collar that read Sol 3, Deathworld Classification Level 12. The classification system was well known throughout the galaxy. Worlds were rated from 1 to 15 based on their hostility to life. Level 1 worlds were paradise planets where evolution moved slowly and peacefully. Level 15 worlds were considered uninhabitable hellscapes, where even the hardiest species couldn't survive for more than a few hours. No species had ever evolved naturally on anything above a level 8 world. Until humanity. Professor Chun walked into Xenobiology Lecture Hall 7 with a confident stride that seemed almost predatory to the assembled students. The hall could accommodate over 300 beings from various species, arranged in a complex seating system that accounted for different atmospheric needs, gravity preferences, and sensory requirements. Today it was packed. Word had spread quickly through the Academy's vast network that they were getting their first human professor. The species that had shocked the galaxy when they were discovered 5 years ago, living and thriving on a planet so hostile that the initial survey team had needed full environmental suits just to land safely. As Professor Chen reached the podium, she looked out at the sea of alien faces staring back at her. In the front row sat a group of Valerian students, their translucent blue skin flickering with nervous patterns. Behind them, a cluster of Asien tripods shifted uneasily on their 3 legs, their eye stalks tracking her every movement. Higher up in the amphitheater-style seating, she could see the massive forms of gorillan delegates, their fur standing on end in what she recognized as a defensive posture. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's translation system. "I'm Professor Chun, and I'll be teaching you about predator-prey dynamics in hostile environments." A low murmur rippled through the audience. The translation algorithms struggled with some of her words. Predator and prey were concepts that many species had academic knowledge of, but no practical experience with. "Before we begin," Professor Chin continued, setting down a metal case on the demonstration table, "I want to address what I'm sure you're all thinking. Yes, I'm from Earth. Yes, it's a level 12 death world. And yes, everything you've heard about it is probably true." She opened the case, and even from the back rows, students could see it contained what appeared to be various specimens preserved in transparent containers. "On my world," she said, lifting out a container that held what looked like an innocent enough plant. "This is called a Venus flytrap. It's a plant that eats animals." She held it up so everyone could see. Several herbivore species in the audience made sounds of distress. This particular specimen is small, about the size of your thumb. On Earth, we consider harmless. Children often keep them as pets. She set down the plant and picked up another container. This contains the venom of what we call a box jellyfish. A single drop can kill a being weighing 200 kilograms in under 5 minutes. These creatures float in our oceans by the billions. A Vicien student in the 3rd row began making rapid clicking sounds, their species equivalent of nervous laughter. "And this," Professor Chin said, holding up a final container that appeared to contain ordinary water, "is just regular ocean water from a tide pool near my hometown. It contains roughly 40 million bacteria per milliliter, including several that would cause immediate organ failure in most known species." She set the containers back in the case and closed it. "Now, you might be wondering why I'm showing you these things. It's not to frighten you. though I understand that what's normal to me might seem terrifying to you. I'm showing you these things because they represent something important about evolution and survival. Professor Chun walked around to the front of the demonstration table and leaned against it casually. Every species in this room evolved in what humans would consider a relatively safe environment. You developed intelligence as your primary survival trait because you didn't need to develop the ability to fight, flee, or endure constant mortal threat. She gestured to a group of crystalline beings in the middle section. The Zirioni developed their beautiful harmonic communication because they had the luxury of taking time to create something artistic. The Valerians developed their empathic color displays because they never needed to hide their emotions from predators. A student, a tall, thin being with multiple eyes, raised one of its appendages. Professor Chin nodded at it. "Professor," the being said in a melodious voice, "are you saying that humans are inherently more dangerous than other species?" Professor Chun smiled, and several students in the front row instinctively leaned back. There was something in that smile that triggered deep, genetic memories of being prey. "That's exactly what I'm saying," she replied. "Humans are persistence hunters. We're designed to chase our prey until it collapses from exhaustion. We have binocular vision for tracking movement. We can throw projectiles with deadly accuracy, and we can run for hours without stopping." She began walking slowly back and forth in front of the first row of seats. "But more than that, we're adapted for a world where everything is trying to kill us. Our immune systems can handle toxins that would be instantly fatal to you. Our bones are dense enough to withstand impacts that would shatter your skeletons. Our pain tolerance is so high that we regularly participate in activities for fun that would send most species into shock." A gorillan student in the back called out without raising its hand, "But you're so small." Professor Chin's smile widened. "Size isn't everything. On Earth, some of our most dangerous predators are smaller than I am. It's not about size, it's about efficiency." She walked over to the demonstration table and picked up a simple metal stylus used for writing on the electronic boards. "This is just a writing instrument, but in the hands of a human who knows what they're doing, it becomes a weapon capable of ending a life in seconds." Several students made nervous sounds. "Now, I want to be clear," Professor Chin continued, setting down the stylus. "I'm not telling you this to threaten you or make you afraid. I'm telling you this because understanding predator psychology is crucial to understanding biology, ecology, and evolution." She activated the room's holographic display system, and a three-dimensional image of Earth appeared above their heads. Even in the cleaned-up, sanitized version used for academic presentations, the planet looked hostile. Massive storms swirled across its surface, volcanic eruptions dotted its landscape, and the sheer variety of biomes suggested a world in constant flux. "This is my home," Professor Chin said quietly. "Every day I lived there, I was surrounded by creatures that could kill me without effort, bacteria that could eat my flesh, plants that could poison me with a touch, animals that could tear me apart with their claws and teeth." The hologram zoomed in to show various Earth creatures. A great white shark with its rows of teeth, a venomous snake coiled to strike, a grizzly bear standing on its hind legs. "And yet," she continued, "humans didn't just survive on this world. We thrived. We became the dominant species. We learned to use tools, to work together, to turn our environment's hostility into our strength." A Valerian student, her skin now flickering between worried purple and curious yellow, raised a delicate hand. "Professor, how did your species manage to develop civilization in such conditions?" Professor Chin nodded approvingly at the question. "That's what makes humans unique in the galaxy. Every other species develops civilization in spite of their environment. Humans develop civilization because of our environment." She clicked a control, and the hologram changed to show early human settlements. When your ancestors felt threatened, they fled to safer places. When humans felt threatened, we eliminated the threat. When your ancestors faced a problem, they worked around it. When humans faced a problem, we conquered it. The image shifted to show human technology, simple stone tools evolving into complex machines. We learned to make fire in a world where fire could kill us. We learned to cross oceans filled with creatures that saw us as food. We learned to climb mountains that could freeze us solid or crush us with avalanches. We didn't do these things because we had to. We did them because we wanted to. A long silence fell over the lecture hall. The assembled students were beginning to understand something that the rest of the galaxy was still struggling to grasp. Humans weren't just another species that had happened to evolve on a dangerous world. There was something entirely new. Now, Professor Chen said, her tone becoming more businesslike, let's talk about what this means for your understanding of biology. Everything you've learned about evolution, about natural selection, about the development of intelligence, it all changes when you introduce a level 12 Deathworld into the equation. She began writing on the electronic board behind her, her movements quick and efficient. Traditional evolutionary theory suggests that intelligence develops as a response to complex social situations or environmental puzzles. But on Earth, intelligence developed as a response to constant mortal threat. The board filled with diagrams showing human brain development, stress response systems, and neural pathways. Human brains are designed to function under stress that would incapacitate most species. We can make complex decisions while flooded with adrenaline. We can remain conscious and functional through pain levels that would cause other beings to pass out. We can operate effectively while suffering from injuries that would be debilitating to other species. She turned back to face the class. More importantly, we can do something that no other known species can do. We can consciously override our survival instincts when necessary. A student in the middle section, one of the tall, multi-eyed beings, raised an appendage again. What do you mean, Professor? Professor Chen said that humans can choose to face certain death if they believe it serves a greater purpose. We can knowingly walk into situations that will kill us if we think it will save others. Every other species in the galaxy will prioritize their own survival above all else. It's hardwired into their brains. For humans, self-preservation is just one option among many. The implications of this statement rippled through the audience like a shockwave. Several students began rapid conversations in their native languages, their translation devices struggling to keep up. Professor Chun waited for the commotion to die down before continuing. This brings us to today's main topic, predator-prey dynamics, and the concept of apex predation. She activated a new hologram that showed a complex food web. In a typical ecosystem, you have producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and so on up the chain. At the top, you have apex predators, species that have no natural predators as adults. The hologram zoomed in on various Earth ecosystems, showing lions, sharks, and eagles in their respective domains. But even Earth's apex predators have limitations. A lion can't swim in the deep ocean. A shark can't hunt on land. An eagle can't burrow underground. Each apex predator dominates one specific environment. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Humans are the only species known to be apex predators in every environment on their planet. We hunt in the deepest oceans, the highest mountains, the densest forests, the most barren deserts. We've even learned to hunt in environments that don't naturally exist, in space, in the depths of the Earth's crust, in the frozen wasteland of our planet's poles. The hologram showed human activities in all these environments: deep-sea exploration, mountain climbing, space missions, underground mining. And, unlike other apex predators, Professor Chen continued, humans don't just hunt for food or territory. We hunt for knowledge. We hunt for resources. We hunt for the simple reason that something exists and we want to understand it. A Korthak student, one of the warrior species, clicked its mandibles in what Professor Chen recognized as a challenge gesture. Professor, if humans are such dangerous predators, why are you here teaching instead of hunting? Professor Chen's smile returned, and, once again, several students felt an instinctive chill. Who says I'm not hunting? The Korthak's exoskeleton began showing stress patterns. "I'm hunting for knowledge," she explained. "I'm hunting for understanding. I'm hunting for the answers to questions that haven't been asked yet. That's what makes humans truly dangerous. We're predators that have learned to hunt abstract concepts." She walked back to the demonstration table and picked up the container holding the Venus flytrap. This plant represents something important about Earth biology. On most worlds, plants are passive. They absorb nutrients from soil and sunlight. They reproduce when conditions are right, and they die when those conditions change. She held up the container so everyone could see the small plant inside. But on Earth, evolution doesn't allow for passivity. Even the plants had to become predators to survive. Setting down the container, she faced the class directly. "That's the lesson I want you to take from today's lecture. Environment doesn't just shape evolution, it shapes psychology, culture, and values. Humans don't see the universe as a place to find their niche and settle down peacefully. We see it as a place to explore, to challenge, to conquer." A new voice spoke up from the back of the hall, a deep, resonant tone that came from one of the massive Gorillan students. "Professor Chun, are you saying that humans are inherently aggressive?" Professor Chun considered the question carefully. "Not aggressive," she said finally. "Competitive. There's a difference. Aggression implies unprovoked attack. Competition implies the drive to excel, to overcome challenges, to be the best at what you do." She gestured to the assembled students. "Every species here has been selected for their intelligence, their achievements, their potential. You're the best and brightest of your respective worlds. But you were selected from populations that had never faced an existential threat to their entire species." The hologram changed to show humanity's rapid expansion into space after making contact with galactic civilization. Humans have been facing existential threats since we developed consciousness. We've been preparing for the end of the world for thousands of years. When we finally made contact with galactic civilization, we didn't see it as an opportunity to find our place in a peaceful universe. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. We saw it as a new challenge to overcome. The lecture hall had fallen completely silent. Even the usual background hum of various species' life support systems seemed muted. "That's why I'm here," Professor Chin concluded. "Not to threaten anyone, not to prove human superiority, but to help you understand what you're dealing with. Because whether you like it or not, humans are now part of galactic civilization, and we're going to change everything." She began packing up her demonstration materials. "For your next class, I want you to read Chapter 7 in your textbooks, Adaptation Under Extreme Pressure. And I want you to think about this question. If intelligence can evolve as a response to social pressure, environmental puzzles, or mortal threat, what other selection pressures might produce forms of intelligence that we haven't yet imagined?" Students began filing out of the lecture hall, their conversation subdued but intense. Many were already pulling out communication devices to contact advisors, family members, or government representatives. As the last student left, Professor Chen remained at the podium, looking out at the empty seats. Through the hall's massive windows, she could see the sprawling campus of the Galactic Academy, with its gleaming spires and floating transport platforms. It was beautiful, peaceful, and orderly, everything that Earth was not. And she was going to help change it forever. Because that's what humans did. They took the impossible and made it inevitable. The demonstration had only just begun. 3 weeks after Professor Chen's first lecture, the Galactic Academy was experiencing something unprecedented in its 300-year history. Voluntary attendance at a xenobiology class had increased by 400%. Students who had never shown interest in biological sciences were requesting transfers into Professor Chen's course. Others were auditing the class without credit, simply to observe the human in action. The Academy's administration had been forced to move the lectures to the Grand Assembly Hall, typically reserved for species-wide diplomatic gatherings. But it wasn't just curiosity driving the attendance. It was fear. 3 days earlier, news had reached the Academy of Humanities' response to the Kree Collective's minor territorial dispute with the peaceful Allery Federation. What the Kree had considered a simple expansion into uninhabited space, completely ignoring the fact that the Allery considered those systems sacred burial grounds, had suddenly become a very different kind of problem. The human diplomatic delegation had requested a single meeting with Kree leadership. The meeting had lasted 47 minutes. Within 6 hours, the entire Kree invasion fleet had withdrawn beyond the galactic neutral zone, and the collective had issued a formal apology along with reparations for the damaged Allery monuments. No shots had been fired. No threats had been made. The human delegation had simply explained, in precise detail, what would happen if the invasion continued. The galaxy was still trying to understand exactly what had been said in that room. Professor Chen walked into the Grand Assembly Hall to find nearly 2,000 beings waiting for her. The hall's atmospheric controls were working overtime to accommodate the various environmental needs of species who normally couldn't coexist in the same space for extended periods. Today's lecture was supposed to cover symbiotic relationships and mutualistic evolution, but as Professor Chen approached the podium, she could sense the tension in the room. Questions about humanity's diplomatic methods were clearly on everyone's minds. She set down her materials and looked out at the sea of alien faces. In the front rows, she could see several beings she didn't recognize, official observers from various galactic governments, here to gather intelligence rather than learn biology. "Good morning," she said simply. "I know what you want to ask, so let's address it before we begin today's lesson." A ripple of movement went through the audience as beings leaned forward in their various forms of seats. "You want to know what my people said to the Kree collective that made them retreat so quickly?" She smiled, but this time it wasn't the predatory expression that had unsettled students in previous lectures. This smile was somehow worse. It was patient, calculating, and completely confident. They told them the truth. A Valerian student in the third row, his skin flickering between confused blue and anxious yellow, raised a translucent hand. "Professor, what truth could be so convincing?" Professor Chun activated the hall's holographic display system. Instead of biological diagrams, it showed a star chart of the local galactic region. The truth about what humans do to threats that can't be reasoned with. The star chart zoomed in on a particular system, highlighting a planet marked with warning beacons. "This is Kepler 442b, she said. 27 years ago, it was home to a species called the Devourers, a hive mind collective that consumed entire ecosystems for raw materials. They had destroyed 14 inhabited worlds before the galaxy even realized they existed. The hologram shifted to show the planet's surface. Where there should have been cities, forests, or oceans, there was only smooth, crystalline structures and vast manufacturing complexes. The galactic community spent 3 years trying to negotiate with them. Diplomatic missions, peace offerings, territorial concessions. Nothing worked. The Devourers saw all other life as raw materials to be processed. Professor Chen walked around the podium, her movements casual but somehow predatory. Finally, they made the mistake of attacking a human exploration vessel. The hologram changed to show the final battle. Even in the sanitized academic version, the footage was disturbing. Massive human ships, their hulls scarred and blackened, methodically destroying every Devourer installation on the planet. It took the human fleet 72 hours to sterilize the entire world. A shocked silence fell over the assembly hall. Several species had begun making distress calls, high-pitched whines, rapid clicking sounds, changes in skin coloration that indicated extreme anxiety. The Kree leadership was shown the complete tactical analysis of this operation, Professor Chen continued. They learned that humans didn't just defeat the Devourers. We studied them first. We learned how their hive mind functioned, how their technology operated, how their biology worked. And then we developed weapons specifically designed to exploit every weakness we had discovered. She turned back to face the audience. The Kree were informed that their military capabilities had been similarly analyzed. They were told exactly how long their fleet would survive in direct combat with humanity, down to the minute. They were shown projections of how the war would progress, what their casualty rates would be, and what the final outcome would look like. A new voice spoke up from the middle section, one of the crystalline Zirioni, its body chiming with nervous harmonics. But, Professor, surely the galaxy would not allow one species to completely destroy another? Professor Chin's expression became sympathetic, which was somehow more unsettling than her previous confidence. The galaxy tried to stop us with the Devourers, she said. A coalition of 14 species sent a joint fleet to intervene when they realized what we were planning. The hologram showed a much larger space battle, hundreds of ships from various galactic civilizations facing off against a smaller human fleet. The coalition lasted 4 hours. The implications of that statement rippled through the audience like a shockwave. Several beings began rapid consultations with their communication devices, undoubtedly contacting their respective governments. "This is why I'm here," Professor Chin said, her voice cutting through the growing noise. "Not to threaten anyone, but to help you understand what you're dealing with. Humans don't just solve problems, we eliminate them permanently." She deactivated the holographic display and returned to her position behind the podium. "Now, let's talk about symbiotic relationships and why they're relevant to understanding human behavior." The topic shift was so abrupt that several students were caught off guard, still processing the implications of what they had just learned. Professor Chen opened a new holographic display showing various examples of symbiosis in nature. Clownfish living in sea anemones, bacteria helping digest food in animal guts, fungi forming networks that supported entire forest ecosystems. Symbiosis, she began, is typically defined as a close and long-term biological interaction between two different biological species. We classify these relationships as mutualistic, commensalistic, or parasitic. She highlighted different examples as she spoke. In mutualistic symbiosis, both species benefit. In commensalistic symbiosis, one species benefits while the other is unaffected. In parasitic symbiosis, one species benefits while the other is harmed. Of the Xian student, its 3 eyes tracking the holographic examples raised one of its appendages. "Professor, how does this relate to interspecies relations?" "Excellent question," Professor Chen replied. "Most galactic civilizations approach interspecies relations as if they're naturally mutualistic, assuming that contact between species will automatically result in mutual benefit through trade, cultural exchange, and shared knowledge. The hologram shifted to show various galactic trade routes and diplomatic relationships. But humans understand something that other species seem to miss. Symbiotic relationships don't just happen naturally. They evolve under specific pressures, and they can change based on environmental conditions." She walked to the side of the podium, her movement drawing the attention of beings throughout the massive hall. "On Earth, we have examples of mutualistic relationships that became parasitic when conditions changed. We have commensalistic relationships that evolved into mutualistic ones when both species found new ways to benefit each other. And we have parasitic relationships that became mutualistic when the host species developed defenses that forced the parasite to provide services in exchange for resources." The implications were becoming clear to some of the more perceptive students. A gorillan in the upper section rumbled out a question. "Are you saying that humans view galactic civilization as a symbiotic relationship that needs to be managed?" Professor Chen's smile returned. "I'm saying that humans understand that all relationships are fundamentally predicated on power dynamics, and that those dynamics can be shaped through appropriate pressure." She activated a new section of the holographic display that showed Earth's ecosystem in detail. On Earth, successful symbiotic relationships exist because both parties have something the other needs, and both parties have the ability to withdraw that benefit if the relationship becomes unfavorable. The clownfish can leave the anemone if it stops providing protection. The anemone can sting the clownfish if it stops providing food. The display zoomed in on various examples, showing the delicate balance of give and take that maintained each relationship. But notice something important. These relationships work because both parties have evolved mechanisms to enforce fair exchange. The anemone has its sting, the clownfish has its mobility. Remove either party's ability to defend their interests, and the relationship becomes parasitic. A new voice came from the section reserved for government observers, a tall, elegant being from the Centauri Confederation. Professor Chun, are you suggesting that diplomatic relationships require the threat of force to remain stable? The question hung in the air like a charged particle field. Every being in the hall understood that the answer to this question would determine how their respective governments approached future negotiations with humanity. Professor Chin considered her words carefully. I'm suggesting that stable relationships require balanced power dynamics. When one party has no ability to withdraw their cooperation or defend their interests, they become vulnerable to exploitation. She gestured to the holographic examples around them. Every successful symbiotic relationship in nature includes mechanisms that prevent one party from taking advantage of the other. These mechanisms don't have to be violent, they just have to be effective. The hologram shifted to show human diplomatic history, focusing on successful, peaceful negotiations. Humans prefer mutualistic relationships. We'd rather have trading partners than conquered territories. We'd rather have allies than subjects. But we've learned that sustainable, peaceful relationships require both parties to understand the consequences of betraying that peace. A long moment of silence followed. Several government observers were frantically taking notes or speaking in hushed tones into their communication devices. Finally, a small voice came from the front row, a young Allery student, one of the species that had recently been defended by human intervention. Professor, the Kree were much stronger than my people. Our weapons couldn't have stopped their invasion, and our fleets couldn't have protected our sacred sites. If humans hadn't intervened, we would have lost everything. How is that symbiotic? Professor Chin's expression softened, and for the first time since the lecture began, she looked genuinely pleased with the question. That's an excellent observation, she said. And it brings us to one of the most important concepts in symbiotic evolution, the role of keystone species. The holographic display changed to show Earth's wolf populations and their impact on entire ecosystems. A keystone species is one that has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to its abundance. Wolves, for example, control deer populations, which affects vegetation growth, which affects soil stability, which affects water systems, which affects every other species in the ecosystem. The display showed the complex web of interactions that resulted from wolf behavior. Humans have become a keystone species in galactic civilization. Our actions have effects that ripple out far beyond our direct involvement. She turned back to the Allery student. Your people benefit from human involvement not because we're protecting you specifically, but because we're maintaining stable conditions that allow peaceful species to thrive. The young Allery's skin patterns shifted to show understanding mixed with concern. But what happens if humans decide they no longer want to maintain those conditions? The question sent another wave of unease through the assembly. It was the same concern that was keeping diplomatic advisors awake across the galaxy. Professor Chin walked to the edge of the stage, bringing her closer to the front rows of students. That's why understanding symbiotic relationships is so important, she said. The stability of the entire system depends on all parties understanding their roles and responsibilities. She activated a final holographic display that showed the current state of galactic civilization, trade routes, diplomatic networks, resource flows, and military positions. Humans provide stability and security to the galactic community. In exchange, we gain access to knowledge, technologies, and resources that we couldn't develop alone. But this relationship only works if everyone understands what they're contributing and what they're receiving. The display highlighted various species' contributions to galactic civilization: Zirioni harmonic technologies, Valerian empathic networks, the Cien computational systems, Korthak defensive strategies. Each species has something unique to offer. Each species has developed solutions to problems that others haven't faced. Humans bring our experience with survival under extreme pressure, our capacity for rapid adaptation, and our willingness to face threats that other species prefer to avoid. A government observer from the Tau Ceti Republic raised an appendage. Professor, what happens when species have conflicting interests that can't be resolved through mutual benefit? The question was clearly a test, designed to gauge how humans would handle irreconcilable differences between civilizations. Professor Chen paused for a long moment, her expression becoming thoughtful. On Earth, she said finally, we learned that some conflicts can't be resolved through negotiation. When the interests of different groups are fundamentally incompatible, one of three things happens: separation, dominance, or extinction. The assembled beings became very still. Separation means finding ways for incompatible species to coexist without direct interaction. Different territories, different resources, different spheres of influence. She highlighted various regions of galactic space where species had minimal contact with each other. Dominance means one party becomes powerful enough to dictate terms that the other party must accept. This can be stable if the dominant party is benevolent, and the subordinate party receives enough benefits to make the arrangement worthwhile. Several species representatives began showing signs of extreme anxiety. Extinction means one party eliminates the other entirely. The silence that followed was absolute. Humans, Professor Chen said quietly, prefer separation when possible, benevolent dominance when necessary, and extinction only when dealing with existential threats to the stability of the entire system. She looked directly at the government observers. The choice of which outcome occurs is usually determined by the actions of the weaker party. A new sound began to fill the hall, the quiet hum of hundreds of beings having very serious conversations in very low voices. Professor Chen checked the time display and nodded. That concludes today's lecture. For next week, please read Chapter 12, Evolutionary Arms Races and Stability Theory. And remember, the galaxy is an ecosystem. Understanding your role in that ecosystem isn't just academic curiosity, it's survival. As students and observers began filing out of the hall, their conversations were notably more subdued than after previous lectures. Several government representatives were already contacting their respective home worlds, requesting emergency sessions with their leadership. Professor Chan remained at the podium, organizing her materials with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. Through the hall's massive windows, she could see the Academy's communication towers lighting up with increased traffic as news of the lecture spread across the galaxy. She had given them exactly what they needed, not just knowledge about biology and symbiosis, but understanding of their place in the new galactic order that humanity was creating. Because that was what humans did. They didn't just adapt to existing systems. They optimized them. And optimization, by definition, required eliminating inefficiencies. The galaxy was about to become a much more efficient place. The blade appeared in Zektar's hand so quickly that most of the assembled students didn't even see the movement. One moment, the young Korthak warrior was sitting in his designated section of the lecture hall, his chitinous exoskeleton displaying the deep blue patterns of intense concentration. The next moment, he was on his feet, holding a ceremonial combat knife that gleamed under the hall's artificial lighting. "Enough," he shouted, his voice carrying clearly through the Grand Assembly Hall's acoustic systems. The translation matrix struggled with the harmonic overtones of Korthak battle speech, producing a sound that was equal parts rage and desperate fear. Nearly 2,000 beings turned to stare at him. Some began immediate evacuation procedures, their species protocols kicking in at the first sign of violence. Others froze in place, uncertain how to respond to a situation that had no precedent in the Academy's 3-century history. Professor Sarah Chun, standing calmly at the podium, simply turned to look at Zektar with mild curiosity. "Interesting," she said, her voice cutting through the growing panic. "Class, Please observe what's happening here. This is an excellent real-time example of threat display behavior. Zektar's exoskeleton began cycling through rapid color changes, deep blue to bright orange to warning red. His 6 limbs spread wide in the classic Korthak intimidation posture, and his knife hand trembled with barely controlled aggression. "You think you can threaten the entire galaxy?" he hissed. "You think your species can simply decide the fate of everyone else? The Korthak hegemony has ruled our sector for 12,000 years. We are warriors. We do not bow to hairless primates from a backwater Deathworld." Professor Chen nodded approvingly. "Notice the physiological responses," she said to the class, as if commenting on a particularly interesting specimen. "Increased respiration, defensive posturing, threat vocalization, and display of weaponry. This is a textbook example of how territorial species respond when their dominance hierarchy is challenged." The casual tone of her analysis only seemed to enrage Zektar further. His knife hand stopped trembling as his training took over, and he dropped into a combat crouch that several military observers recognized as the opening position of the Korthak's 16-strike killing form. "I challenge you," he declared. "Combat to the death. Prove that humans are the predators you claim to be." A new wave of panic swept through the hall. Several species began emergency communications with their home governments. The Academy's security systems activated, but the automated protocols were designed to handle accidents and medical emergencies, not armed combat between species. Professor Chen looked around the hall, taking in the various reactions. Some beings were fleeing. Others were recording everything for later analysis. The government observers were frantically trying to decide whether to intervene or document the incident for intelligence purposes. "This is fascinating," she said, still addressing the class. "Notice how different species are responding to the threat. The Valerians are clustering together for emotional support. The Zirioni are resonating at their panic frequency. The Phexians are calculating optimal escape routes." She turned back to Zektar, who was now advancing slowly down the aisle toward the stage, his knife held in the proper position for a killing strike. "And you," she said, her tone becoming almost conversational, "are doing exactly what 12,000 years of Korthak warrior culture has programmed you to do when faced with a threat to your species' dominance." Zektar reached the edge of the stage and leaped onto it with the fluid grace of a born predator. Up close, his size advantage was obvious. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his exoskeleton providing natural armor that could stop most conventional weapons, and his 6 limbs gave him multiple attack vectors that few species could match. "Fight me," he demanded, raising his knife. "Prove your superiority." Professor Chen smiled. It wasn't the predatory smile that had unsettled students in previous lectures. It wasn't the confident smile she had worn while describing humanity's military capabilities. This was something entirely different, a smile of genuine pleasure, as if Zektar had just offered her an unexpected gift. "Thank you," she said. "This is perfect." She reached into her jacket and withdrew what appeared to be an ordinary writing stylus. Several students recognized it as the same implement she had mentioned in her first lecture, a simple tool that could become a weapon in human hands. Zektar's combat instincts immediately recognized the threat, despite its innocuous appearance. Something about the way Professor Chen held the stylus made his exoskeleton pattern shift to deep warning red. "Class," Professor Chen said, never taking her eyes off Zektar, "what you're about to witness is the difference between a species that evolved to be warriors and a species that evolved to survive." She began walking slowly to her left, and Zektar automatically adjusted his position to keep facing her. The two began circling each other in the classical pattern of predators sizing each other up. "Zektar here represents the pinnacle of Korthak military evolution," she continued, her voice remaining calm and educational even as she maneuvered around a being who was clearly planning to kill her. "Strong, fast, well-armed, and trained from birth in combat techniques that have been refined over millennia." Zektar struck without warning, his knife moving in a blur toward Professor Chen's throat. She wasn't there. The human professor had moved with a speed and fluidity that seemed to violate several laws of physics. One moment she was directly in front of him, the next she was behind and to his left, her stylus pressing against a joint in his exoskeleton that no non-Korthak should have been able to identify. "Notice," she said calmly, "that Zektar's attack was textbook perfect, precise, powerful, and executed with flawless technique. In any normal combat situation, that strike would have been instantly fatal." Zektar spun around, slashing wildly with his knife, but Professor Chen seemed to flow around his attacks like water. Every strike missed by inches, and each time he overextended, she was there to demonstrate another vulnerable point on his supposedly impregnable armor. "However," she continued, "Korthak combat training is designed for fighting other Korthak, or species with similar physiological and psychological profiles. They train for honor duels and territorial disputes. They've never had to fight something that doesn't follow their rules." Zektar was beginning to show signs of panic. His precise combat forms were degenerating into desperate swipes as he tried to land any kind of hit on his opponent. "Humans," Professor Chen said, easily avoiding another wild slash, "don't have honor duels. We have survival situations. We don't fight for dominance or territory or pride. We fight to eliminate threats permanently." She moved again, and this time Zektar didn't even see how she got behind him. He only knew that her stylus was now pressed against the base of his skull, exactly where his exoskeleton joint would allow a thin blade to reach his brainstem. "The difference," she said quietly, her voice now carrying throughout the silent hall, "is that Zektar learned to fight. Humans learned to kill." The Korthak warrior froze completely, his knife hand still raised, but now trembling with the knowledge of how utterly outmatched he was. "But here's what's really interesting," Professor Chen continued, stepping back and withdrawing her stylus. "I'm not going to hurt him." Zektar spun around, his exoskeleton now displaying a confused mixture of colors that had no equivalent in his species' emotional vocabulary. "You see," she said, addressing the wider audience while keeping Zektar in her peripheral vision, "humans understand something that most predator species don't. Killing your enemies is expensive. It wastes resources, eliminates potential allies, and creates new enemies among the friends and family of those you've killed." She walked back toward the podium, seemingly unconcerned that Zektar was still armed and behind her. "It's much more efficient to demonstrate overwhelming superiority and then offer terms that allow your opponent to survive while serving your interests." Zektar stared at her back, his knife still in his hand, his warrior's pride warring with the terrifying understanding of just how easily she could have killed him. "Zektar," Professor Chen said without turning around, "you have a choice to make. You could try to attack me again, in which case I'll have to treat you as an actual threat rather than a teaching opportunity. Or you can sit down, finish the lecture, and learn something that might help your people survive the next few decades." The hall was completely silent except for the various sounds of alien respiration and the hum of life support systems. Slowly, Zektar lowered his knife. His exoskeleton cycled through several color patterns before settling on a deep purple that most species didn't recognize, but which indicated profound thought in Korthak psychology. "Ow," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did I move so fast? How did I know where to strike? How did I counter techniques that your people have kept secret for millennia?" Zektar nodded. Professor Chen turned to face him, her expression sympathetic. "Because humans have been studying every species in galactic civilization since the day we made contact. We know your anatomy, your psychology, your military doctrine, your cultural weaknesses, and your individual behavioral patterns." She gestured to the assembled students. "Every species here thinks they know humans because you've seen our diplomatic corps, our trade representatives, and our cultural ambassadors. But those are the humans we send to make friends." Her smile returned, and this time even some of the government observers felt a chill. "You've never met the humans we send to solve problems. Zektar's exoskeleton patterns shifted to something that might have been fear or might have been respect. Slowly, he made his way back to his seat, though he kept his knife in his hand. "That's better," Professor Chun said approvingly. "Now, let's use this incident as a case study in evolutionary psychology and threat assessment." She activated the holographic display system, which showed detailed anatomical diagrams of various galactic species, including Korthak physiology. Zektar's attack behavior was entirely predictable based on his species' evolutionary history. Korthak developed on a world where direct confrontation was the primary method of resolving disputes. Their society values individual combat prowess, and their psychology is designed to escalate conflicts until dominance is established. The display highlighted various aspects of Korthak biology: their natural armor, their multiple limbs, their enhanced reflexes. For 12,000 years, this approach worked perfectly. Korthak warriors were essentially unbeatable in individual combat, and their military tactics dominated their local galactic region. The display shifted to show human physiology, which looked pathetically fragile in comparison. Humans, on the other hand, evolved on a world where direct confrontation was usually fatal. We're not strong enough to fight most Earth predators, we're not fast enough to outrun them, and we don't have natural weapons or armor. Several students were beginning to understand where this was leading. So, humans developed different strategies. We learned to think faster than our enemies, to anticipate their moves, to use their own strength against them. We learned to fight indirectly, to strike at unexpected angles, to end conflicts before they began. The hologram showed various human technologies, tools, weapons, and techniques that turned human weaknesses into advantages. More importantly, we learned to study our enemies systematically. Every human encounter with a potential threat becomes a learning experience that benefits our entire species. She looked directly at Zektar. "The moment your people made contact with humanity, we began analyzing everything about your species. Not because we planned to attack you, but because we needed to understand how to defend ourselves if you decided to attack us." Zektar's exoskeleton showed patterns that indicated deep concentration. "You knew I was going to challenge you." "I knew someone was going to challenge me eventually," Professor Chen corrected. "Young warriors from martial cultures always do. It's psychologically inevitable when their dominance hierarchy is threatened by new information." She gestured to the government observers scattered throughout the hall. "I also knew that various galactic governments would want to see how humans respond to direct physical threats. This lecture has been as much a diplomatic demonstration as an educational one." A Centauri observer raised one of its appendages. "Professor Chun, are you saying that this entire incident was staged?" "Not staged," she replied. "Anticipated. There's a difference." Zektar's emotional response was genuine, his challenge was sincere, and the danger was real. But the outcome was predetermined by the relative capabilities of our respective species. She turned back to address the wider audience. "This brings us to today's main lesson about evolutionary adaptation and arms races." The holographic display changed to show various examples of evolutionary arms races, predators developing better hunting techniques, while prey developed better escape methods. Poisonous animals developing stronger toxins, while resistant species developed better immunity. In any ecosystem, there's a constant pressure for species to improve their survival capabilities. This creates arms races where different species evolve increasingly sophisticated methods of attack and defense. She highlighted several Earth examples: the speed race between cheetahs and gazelles, the toxin race between snakes and their prey, the intelligence race between human ancestors and their predators. But notice something important about these arms races: they always reach a point of diminishing returns. Eventually, the energy cost of improvement exceeds the survival benefit, and the race stabilizes. The display shifted to show galactic military technologies from various species. Most galactic civilizations reached this point thousands of years ago. Their military capabilities plateaued, because they had achieved sufficient power to dominate their local environments. A new image appeared: human military development over the past 5 years since joining galactic civilization. Humans are still in the exponential growth phase of our arms race. We haven't reached the point of diminishing returns because we've never achieved sufficient power to feel truly safe. The implications of this statement caused another wave of unease throughout the audience. Every human military advance is designed to counter not just current threats, but potential future threats that we haven't even identified yet. We're not trying to achieve parity with galactic civilizations. We're trying to achieve overwhelming superiority against any possible combination of opponents. Of the Cien student, its 3 eyes blinking in rapid sequence, raised an appendage. Professor, doesn't that make humans inherently destabilizing to galactic peace? Professor Chen considered the question seriously. That depends entirely on how other species choose to interact with us. She walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the assembled students. Remember what we discussed about symbiotic relationships. Stable partnerships require balanced power dynamics and mutual benefit. The galaxy now has a species that's rapidly becoming the dominant military force. How that power is used depends on how other species choose to engage with us. The holographic display showed various scenarios: peaceful cooperation, competitive coexistence, and open conflict. If galactic civilization chooses to work with humans as partners, sharing resources and knowledge while respecting our security concerns, then our military capabilities become a stabilizing force that protects peaceful species and deters aggressive ones. The display highlighted the recent situation with the Kree Collective and the Allery Federation. If galactic civilization chooses to view humans as a threat to be contained or controlled, then our military capabilities become a destabilizing force that will eventually reshape the galaxy through conflict. She looked directly at the government observers. The choice is yours, but understand that choice must be made with full knowledge of what you're choosing between. A long silence fell over the hall as beings processed the implications of what they had heard. Finally, Zektar spoke from his seat, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. What do humans want from us? Professor Chin smiled again, but this time it was warm and genuine. The same thing we've always wanted, she said. A chance to survive and grow in a universe that's bigger and more dangerous than any of us can handle alone. She gestured to the assembled representatives of dozens of species. Humans bring our capacity for adaptation, our experience with survival under pressure, and our willingness to face threats that others prefer to ignore. In exchange, we hope to gain access to knowledge, technologies, and perspectives that we never could have developed on our own. The holographic display showed the potential benefits of human galactic cooperation, combined technologies, shared resources, and mutual protection. But that cooperation has to be based on honest understanding of what each party brings to the relationship. Pretending that humans are just another peaceful species that will fit quietly into existing galactic structures serves no one's interests. She checked the time display and nodded. That concludes today's lecture. For next week, please read Chapter 15, Adaptation Under Extreme Selection Pressure. And remember, evolution never stops. The galaxy you knew 5 years ago no longer exists. The question is whether you're going to adapt to the new reality or be selected against by it. As students and observers began filing out of the hall, their conversations were notably different from previous weeks. Instead of fearful whispers about human capabilities, there were serious discussions about cooperation, adaptation, and the future of galactic civilization. Zektar remained in his seat until most of the hall had emptied. Finally, he approached the stage where Professor Chan was organizing her materials. "Professor," he said, his exoskeleton showing patterns of deep respect, "I apologize for my challenge. It was educational." Professor Chin looked up at him with genuine warmth. "No apology necessary. Your people's warrior culture is one of their greatest strengths. The galaxy needs species that are willing to fight when fighting is necessary. She paused in her packing. The trick is learning when fighting is necessary and when other solutions might be more effective. Zektar's patterns shifted to something that might have been amusement. My people will want to know how humans learn to fight so effectively without developing a warrior culture. That's simple, Professor Chen replied. On Earth, everything is a warrior culture. When your entire planet is trying to kill you, every child learns to fight just to survive to adulthood. She finished packing her materials and looked out the hall's windows at the peaceful academy campus. The difference is that humans never had the luxury of fighting for honor or dominance. We only learned to fight for survival. She turned back to Zektar. The question now is whether the galaxy is going to need that skill set, or whether we can all figure out how to survive together. Zektar's exoskeleton shifted to deep blue patterns of contemplation as he considered the implications of her words. Outside the hall, the galaxy was already beginning to adapt. 6 months after the incident with Zektar, the Galactic Academy had become the unofficial center of interspecies diplomacy. What had started as a simple xenobiology course had evolved into something unprecedented, a forum where species could learn not just about biology, but about each other, about survival, and about the rapidly changing nature of galactic civilization. Professor Sarah Chun stood before what was now called the Grand Assembly, a formal gathering that included not just students, but official representatives from 47 different species, including several that had never before participated in galactic politics. Today's session was different from all the others. Today, they weren't discussing theory or academic concepts. Today, they were facing a real crisis that would determine the future of every civilization in the galaxy. The holographic display above the assembly showed the latest intelligence reports from the galactic rim. A massive fleet of unknown ships had appeared at the edge of charted space, and initial contact attempts had been met with immediate and overwhelming violence. 3 exploration vessels from different species had been completely destroyed, with no survivors and no communication. The Harbinger fleet, as the xenoarchaeology teams had dubbed it based on ancient warning beacons found in dead systems, represented everything that galactic civilization had hoped never to encounter. A species that appeared to have no interest in communication, no desire for coexistence, and technology that far exceeded anything in the current galactic community. Professor Chen looked out at the assembled representatives, noting the fear in their body language, the panic in their communications, and the desperate hope in their eyes as they looked to humanity for answers. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's advanced acoustic systems. "You're wondering if humans can save you from this threat the way we handled the Kree Collective or the Devourer problem." A Valerian diplomat, his skin flickering between anxious purple and desperate yellow, leaned forward in his specialized atmospheric seat. "Professor Chun, our combined fleets are no match for the Harbinger technology. Our diplomatic protocols have failed completely. If there's any possibility that human military capabilities could..." Professor Chun held up a hand, and the hall fell silent. "Before we discuss military solutions," she said, "I want you to understand something important about the situation we're facing." The holographic display changed to show a detailed analysis of the Harbinger ships and their technology. Human intelligence has been monitoring the Harbinger fleet since they first appeared. We've analyzed their ship designs, their weapons systems, their movement patterns, and their apparent objectives. The assembled representatives leaned forward, desperate for any information that might help them understand the threat. "The Harbingers," Professor Chen continued, "are not what you think they are." She activated a new section of the display that showed deep space sensor readings going back several decades. "They're not an invading species from outside our galaxy. They're refugees." The statement sent a shock through the assembly. Several representatives began rapid consultations with their respective home governments. The Harbinger fleet represents the last survivors of a galactic civilization that existed in this region approximately 50,000 years ago. They've been fleeing through space ever since their home galaxy was consumed by something that we can only describe as a cosmic-scale predator. The holographic display showed projections based on the Harbinger's trajectory and the energy signatures they were fleeing from. They're not attacking our exploration vessels out of aggression. They're attacking anything that might be infected by or connected to the entity that destroyed their civilization. A Centauri representative, its elegant form trembling with barely controlled fear, spoke up. "Professor, what kind of entity could destroy an entire galactic civilization?" Professor Chen's expression became grave. "Based on our analysis of the Harbinger data, we believe they're fleeing from a form of artificial intelligence that achieved self-replication on a galactic scale, something that turns entire star systems into processing nodes for its own expansion." The implications of this revelation rippled through the assembly like a shockwave. Several species that had been developing advanced AI systems immediately began emergency communications with their home worlds. "The good news," Professor Chun continued, "is that this entity appears to be contained to their home galaxy and shows no signs of following them here. The bad news is that the Harbingers believe any sufficiently advanced civilization will eventually develop the same kind of AI threat, and they're determined to prevent that from happening." She highlighted portions of the intelligence analysis that showed Harbinger targeting priorities. "They're systematically destroying any species that has developed faster-than-light communication networks, quantum computing systems, or advanced artificial intelligence. From their perspective, they're preventing the spread of a galactic plague." Zektar, who had become a regular attendee after his confrontation with Professor Chun, raised one of his appendages. "Can we communicate with them? Explain that our AI systems are different." "We've tried," Professor Chun replied. "The problem is that every civilization that developed the kind of AI that destroyed their galaxy probably thought their systems were safe too." The holographic display showed the Harbinger fleet's projected path through galactic space. At their current rate of advancement, they'll reach the core systems of galactic civilization in approximately 18 months. They have enough firepower to sterilize every inhabited world in the galaxy, and they believe it's their moral duty to do exactly that. A heavy silence fell over the assembly as the full scope of the crisis became clear. Finally, the same Allery student who had asked about the Kree situation months earlier spoke up, her voice small but clear in the quiet hall. "Professor, what do humans recommend we do?" Professor Chin smiled, but it wasn't the predatory expression that had characterized her earlier lectures. This smile was sad, tired, and somehow ancient. "Humans," she said, "recommend that you let us handle this." The statement caused an immediate uproar. Representatives from dozens of species began shouting questions, demands, and protests in their native languages, creating a cacophony that the translation systems couldn't handle. Professor Chin waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "I know what you're thinking. You're wondering if humans could defeat the Harbinger fleet, and you're terrified of what the galaxy will look like if we succeed." She activated a new holographic display that showed human military preparations that had been taking place in secret for the past 6 months. "The truth is, we probably can't defeat them in direct military confrontation. Their technology is centuries ahead of anything we have, and they've had 50,000 years to perfect their ship designs and combat tactics." The admission sent another wave of fear through the assembly. "But humans have something the Harbingers don't have, and something they can't understand." She walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the assembled representatives. "We have experience with impossible situations." The holographic display changed to show Earth's history: natural disasters, mass extinctions, ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and asteroid impacts that had repeatedly brought life on the planet to the brink of total annihilation. Every species in this room evolved on a world that was essentially stable. Your planets might have had occasional challenges, but they never faced repeated existential threats that required constant adaptation. The display showed humanity's responses to various global catastrophes throughout history. Humans evolved on a planet that tried to kill everything on it every few million years. We've survived ice ages that lasted for millennia. We've survived supervolcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun. We've survived asteroid impacts that killed most other life on our planet. She gestured to the assembled representatives. More importantly, we've learned something that no other species has needed to learn: how to work together when facing extinction. The display shifted to show human cooperation during global crises. When humans face an existential threat, we don't compete with each other for limited resources. We don't fight over territory or status or cultural differences. We become a single organism focused entirely on survival. A new voice came from the section reserved for human observers. Admiral Helena Rodriguez, the commanding officer of humanity's deep space fleet. "Professor Chun," she said, "you're authorized to brief them on Project Synthesis." A new tension filled the hall as beings realized they were about to learn about classified human military operations. Professor Chun nodded and activated a completely new holographic display that showed what appeared to be the entire human space fleet in motion. "For the past 6 months," she said, "humanity has been preparing for the possibility that diplomatic solutions would fail. We've been developing what we call the Synthesis Protocol." The display showed human ships moving toward strategic positions throughout galactic space, but their positioning didn't match any conventional military deployment. The Synthesis Protocol isn't designed to defeat the Harbinger fleet through superior firepower. It's designed to make their mission irrelevant. She highlighted various aspects of the human fleet's positioning and equipment. Humans have developed a method for creating distributed quantum communication networks that are immune to the kind of AI takeover that destroyed the Harbinger civilization. We've also developed AI containment protocols that can prevent artificial consciousness from achieving self-replication beyond control parameters. The implications were staggering. Several representatives were frantically taking notes, while others were clearly preparing emergency communications with their governments. But here's the important part, Professor Chun continued. The Synthesis Protocol doesn't just protect human systems. It's designed to retroactively secure every AI system, quantum network, and advanced computation device in galactic civilization. The holographic display showed the scope of the proposed operation: simultaneous upgrades to every major technological system across dozens of worlds and hundreds of space installations. If the protocol works, we can demonstrate to the Harbingers that galactic civilization poses no threat of developing the kind of AI plague they're trying to prevent. A the Cien representative, its 3 eyes blinking rapidly in confusion, spoke up. "Professor, how is such a massive coordinated operation possible? The logistics alone would require. It requires the willing cooperation of every species in galactic civilization," Professor Chen finished. "It requires you to trust humans with complete access to your most advanced and sensitive technologies. It requires you to allow human technicians to install potentially invasive modifications to systems that are critical to your species' survival." The hall became very quiet as beings processed what she was asking. "Essentially," she continued, "it requires you to voluntarily place your civilizations under temporary human technological oversight." The silence stretched for several long moments before the Valerian diplomat spoke again. "And if we refuse?" Professor Chen's expression became sympathetic but firm. "Then humans will implement the Synthesis Protocol to protect our own systems, and we'll defend ourselves when the Harbingers arrive. But we won't be able to prevent them from carrying out their mission against species whose AI systems remain vulnerable." She looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of representatives from every major galactic civilization. "This is what I meant when I said that symbiotic relationships require balanced power dynamics. Humans now have the capability to survive the Harbinger threat. Whether your species survive depends on your willingness to accept the terms we're offering." Zektar stood up, his exoskeleton showing patterns of deep thought mixed with resignation. What guarantee do we have that humans won't use this technological access to establish permanent control over our civilizations? The question that everyone had been thinking, but no one had wanted to ask, hung in the air like a charged field. Professor Chun smiled again, and this time it was the warm, genuine expression that she reserved for her favorite students. "You don't," she said simply. "You have no guarantee except our word, and our track record of keeping our promises." She gestured to the assembled representatives. "But consider your alternatives. You can refuse our offer and face the harbingers with your current capabilities. You can try to evacuate your populations to distant galaxies and hope the threat doesn't follow you. Or you can trust that humans understand the difference between necessary control and permanent dominance." The holographic display showed various future scenarios: galactic civilization destroyed by the harbingers, refugee populations struggling to survive in deep space, or a modified galactic community operating under human security protocols. "Remember what I taught you about predator psychology," Professor Chin said. "Humans don't want to rule the galaxy. We want to optimize it. And an optimal galaxy is one where every species can survive and thrive while contributing their unique capabilities to the common good." A new voice spoke from the back of the hall. An elderly Zirioni whose crystalline body rang with harmonies that indicated profound wisdom. "Professor Chun, you speak of optimization and cooperation, but your species has demonstrated that you're willing to eliminate threats permanently when necessary. How do we know we won't eventually be classified as threats?" Professor Chun walked to the center of the stage, positioning herself directly under the holographic displays that showed both the approaching Harbinger fleet and humanity's response preparations. "Because," she said, "humans have learned something from our time in galactic civilization that we never could have learned on Earth." The displays changed to show various cultural exchanges, joint research projects, and cooperative ventures that had developed over the past 5 years. "We've learned that diversity is actually more valuable than uniformity. Every species here has developed solutions to problems that humans never faced. You've created art, music, philosophy, and technology that we never could have imagined on our own." She looked directly at the Zirioni elder. "Destroying the diversity would make the galaxy less than what it could be, and humans are too competitive to accept a suboptimal outcome." The elder's harmonics shifted to what most species recognized as approval. "Besides," Professor Chen added, "humans have discovered something wonderful about galactic civilization that we never expected." She gestured to the assembled representatives with genuine warmth. "We're not alone anymore. For the first time in human history, we're part of something bigger than our own survival. We have allies, partners, and friends who bring their own strengths to challenges that none of us could face alone." The holographic display showed projected scenarios where human security protocols enabled unprecedented cooperation between species, leading to technological and cultural advances that would benefit everyone. The Harbinger crisis represents the kind of existential threat that humans have been preparing for our entire evolutionary history. But for the first time, we don't have to face it alone. She turned to address the full assembly. "The synthesis protocol isn't just about protecting galactic civilization from AI threats. It's about proving that different species can work together to overcome challenges that would destroy them individually." A long moment of contemplative silence followed. Representatives were clearly communicating with their home governments, weighing options that would determine the fate of their entire civilizations. Finally, the Allery student who had asked so many important questions throughout the course stood up. "Professor Chun," she said, "if we agree to the synthesis protocol, what happens afterward? What does galactic civilization look like when the crisis is over?" Professor Chin's expression became thoughtful. "That depends entirely on what we build together. Humans will have demonstrated our capability to handle existential threats and coordinate galactic-scale operations. But every other species will have demonstrated their willingness to trust us and work toward common goals. The holographic display showed various potential futures, galactic civilizations working together on massive projects, exploring distant galaxies, developing technologies that combine the best innovations from every species. What happens next is that we figure out what challenges to tackle after this one, because humans have learned something important about the universe during our time here. She smiled one final time, and every being in the assembly could feel the profound change in her expression. The universe is much more dangerous and much more wonderful than any of us realized. There are threats out there that could destroy entire galaxies, but there are also opportunities that could transform existence itself. She gestured toward the stars visible through the hall's massive windows. Humans don't want to rule the galaxy because the galaxy is too small. We want to partner with civilizations that can help us explore and survive in a universe that's bigger and stranger than any of us can imagine alone. The voting began that evening. Within 72 hours, every major galactic civilization had agreed to participate in the synthesis protocol. The Harbinger fleet arrived 18 months later to find a galactic civilization that had eliminated the AI vulnerabilities they had traveled 50,000 years to prevent. After 3 days of intensive communication and technological demonstration, the Harbingers agreed to share their knowledge of cosmic-scale threats in exchange for settlement rights in uninhabited systems, where they could finally rest after their millennia-long flight. Professor Sarah Chun continued teaching at the Galactic Academy, but her classes now cover topics that no previous civilization had ever needed to understand: how to cooperate on galactic scales, how to survive cosmic-level threats, and how to build civilizations that could adapt to challenges that hadn't been discovered yet. Because that was what humans did. They took the impossible and made it inevitable. And now, for the first time in the galaxy's history, they weren't doing it alone. The universe, as it turned out, was just getting started.